I think we're going to get going. I know people are still trying to get in.
Can you turn it up, Steve?
Just speak again.
Turn it up.
Oh,
Turn it up. Look, if I got closer to it, it would be better. Okay, how's that?
wow.
Okay, is that better? Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm sorry for the crush, especially at the back there, but we just cannot get any more chairs into this room. So I will get going because there's quite a long way to go. First of all, I want to just thank everybody that helped with this particular talk. It was incredible, the photographs that came out of the woodwork that you'll see tonight, and family stories and that sort of thing. We call these things social and architectural histories, and it sounds very grand, but it's about the people who lived in these houses or built these houses, and often we found the plans which we share with you and so on and so forth. So it's not some highfalutin, it's a down to earth. And I'd particularly like to thank David Just, who I managed to save a front row seat for his fantastic support and his ability to dig out information on people. I don't know where he found the stuff and the photographs, but it's wonderful. So, okay, thank you, Kate. First slide. So, I need my...
You want to do something about the lights?
Oh, yeah. I think there's a switch at the back there. That's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine. Well, maybe a bit more. I can't see now. Okay, that's good.
Yeah, good.
Okay, so I will be talking about the properties on the seaside of the main road, and that's a strip of all of them there. Thank you, Barry, for this beautiful picture. I'll go through a lot of this. Obviously, I won't be talking about all of these houses tonight. It's impossible. You'd be here till tomorrow morning. So we'll basically be talking about, this is a very different area of Kalk Bay to other areas that I've dealt with before, like the Middle Dorp around Windsor Road, Die Dam around Lever Street Park, even the Quarterdeck Estate. Very, very different. So we'll come on to it now. Kate, next one. It's a pity I can't really see, but anyway. All right, so the houses that we'll be talking about are listed here. From there to there. It's from Springtide to Abbey Craig. And I'd like to thank Vaughan de Villiers for the wonderful drone pictures that he let us use. You'll see from this picture, only one house is on the sea side of the railway line, and that is by the sea. But all of them have wonderful views. And you can imagine when they were built, there was absolutely nothing in front of them, no security walls. And the fishing, a lot of people commented on the rock fishing, which was fantastic. Right, next. So, this map shows how bare the stretch of coast was up until 1897. The only buildings apart from Patmos were by the sea, Lisgard and Martin's Cottage, which is down there, which is now Brixton and Walsoken, just before Woolly's Pool. We'll come to see what the trigger was for the burst of development that completely transformed the area. Next, Kate. This picture was taken in about 1910, and it shows how little had been built along this part of Kalk Bay. So you can see that's where the entrance to the harbour is now. There wasn't a harbour, of course. And then you can see Patmos and a few other houses scattered along there. One or two houses had just been built. Okay. Generally, the new houses were substantial, owned and sometimes rented out by people who were well off and from the professional classes. The majority of people who bought and built here were British. They had come to the colony in the 1800s and made good as traders, merchants, bankers. They achieved a lifestyle and status that would have been impossible in the rigid social structures of the UK. The fishing community, who were like Kalk Bay, if you like, had no place in this area. They didn't live here ever, and it became a capsule. It was like separated from the rest of Kalk Bay, and it's still separated from the rest of Kalk Bay. Right, thank you. So we'll go back in time. A very large land transfer was completed on the 21st of July, 1846, to Matthew Gregory Blake. He was a lieutenant colonel. So it's a huge piece. Sorry, you've got to come back. A huge piece of ground, 1.3 acres. So he bought it for the bargain price of £6.10, about 20,000 rand today. It was still a bargain. As can be seen, there was a building. This is referred to as the temporary building of Daniel van Rieenen, built with permission in about 1830. So this is very old Kalk Bay. Right, Kate, thank you. After Blake bought it, this was called Blake's Cottage. It's an old farmhouse used as a stopping place on the way to Simonstown. A 1902 plan shows it's called Hofmeyer's Cottage. He was the owner at that time. It was named Patmos by the Reverend Andrew Murray, who holidayed here between 1906 and 1913. Colonel Matthew Blake was I call a typical colonial. He was born in Jamaica in 1800, a professional soldier. It's not clear what the basis was for granting large pieces of land for nominal amounts. Blake certainly seems to have had a checkered past. He's the first of the men of England who speculated and profited from land in this area. We'll see that he was not the last. Next, Kate. By 1833, Blake was insolvent. He was in Simonstown. He owned an enormous amount of money for the time, about £3,000, which would be about 10.5 million today, and he owed it to dozens of people. He had no fixed assets, but despite this, or perhaps because of his wife's highly respected Munich family, he was appointed Justice of the Peace at Simonstown, an annual salary of £150. A UCT thesis called The Enslaved People of Simonstown paints Blake, among others, in a very poor light. Blake ordered the punishment of a 12-year-old boy who was whipped with a cat of nine tails across his back. This was against the regulations. His back was laid open. He would be scarred for life. For this, Blake got a rap over the knuckles from his superior. The boy was indentured to a cobbler for 14 years, where his hours of work were from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. at night. And one night he ran away. He didn't finish till 8, and that's why he got punished. Despite the cloud over the actions and somewhat unsavory record, this huge earth of Kalk Bay land was granted him in 1846. The next year it was sold from Blake's insolvent estate to Francis Bertrand Pinney for £300, about 900,000 today. So a tidy profit of £293 in 1 year. We'll see more of Francis Pinney shortly. Blake died insolvent at his own house in Wynberg, aged 55. The second major acquisition of land on the 21st July 1846 were grants of huge piece of land to Valentine van Rieenen. Next one, Kate. In 1843, this grandson of the Cluties, the famous Dutch VOC merchant family, bought a Constantia farm of 15,000 vines, and he renamed it Glen Alpine. Under the Van Rienens, Glen Alpine prospered and became a renowned wine estate, visited by many callers to the Cape, including Queen Victoria's son, Prince Alfred. We'd know it today as Constantia Glen. Okay, next. No, back. So this lot, this is the huge lot. It's massive. Anyway, I won't go into it. It's 1.4 acres. He paid £7 for it, for both of them. So there's a public right of way and there's a spring there. I don't know if you can see that. So the spring was an absolutely crucial resource. There's hardly any water in Kalk Bay as we know. There was nothing like pipe water for another 70 years or so.
Where was that in respect of the present day?
The spring, it's at the bottom of the, it isn't there, but it's at the bottom of the cul-de-sac next to Abbey Craig. It's not there, it's dried up or disappeared. Mike Walker noted that Van Rieenen requested land in Kalk Bay in 1833 to construct a small house for his wife, whose health benefited from sea bathing. How wonderful. The house shown here is the site of the original By the Sea. That's it there. The other house there, shown on the earth, is the original Liscard, now at 181 Main Road, also probably built by Van Rieenen in the early 1830s. It's very likely that apart from Mrs. Van Rienen's health benefits, the houses were built here because of the proximity to the spring. Water was a precious commodity, and it was to be more than 70 years before the convenience of piped water reached this area. 70 years. Okay, thank you, Kate. So this 1905 picture next to By the Sea shows a young girl with a bucket heading towards the spring. You can imagine how heavy that bucket was when it was full. So I have got a mental picture of the very large Van Rienen family baking in the heat of summer up in the Constantia Valley, packing up their wagons with their oxen, their horses, their servants, the adults and children, heading to the cooling breezes of Old Kalk Bay. The place was almost completely undeveloped, the sea alive with fish, and here you could lie at night, the waves crashing on the rocks at your door. By the 1840s, Kalk Bay was changing. Holiday homes, an hotel, different type of person in the village. Does this sound familiar? This led to what was a recurring theme over the years, complaints from outsiders about the activities of the fishing community. The colonial secretary asked the resident justice at Simonstown, Francis Pinney, who I mentioned before, to report on the situation. He produced a report in 1847, which I will read out to you. Kalk Bay, in extent about 2 miles, contains but few houses, and most of them are tenanted only during the summer months, it being a watering place and frequented as such. At an inconvenient distance from Cape Town or even Wynberg, the resources of Kalk Bay are so prescribed as to afford no charm to vagrants and other disturbers of order. Burgies, in other words. Hence the proverbial security which the place has hitherto enjoyed. He goes on to say that the recently established and thriving fisheries have caused an influx of people, far exceeding numbers there up until then, and this had materially changed the tone of the place. He said this forms good ground for alarm lest the peace now be in danger of being disturbed. He said there are 5 fishing establishments. 2 of them were whale fisheries, and of course this included what's now St. James, employing between 100 and 200 people. He obviously wasn't personally alarmed, because seeing the potential growth of Kalk Bay, he bought Blake's property here himself the following year and several more properties after that. Thank you, Kate. So starting in 1847, the year of the report, Penny bought up most of the properties along the main road over the next 20 years. So all of this outlined in green. That goes nearly to the corner to Clavelli, a massive piece of land. One piece came to him as a grant, but he bought most of them from Van Rienen. Penny was by far the biggest property owner I've come across. So who was Francis Bertrand Downing Pinney? He was Simonstown based, a colonial government employee with many years' service. He was born in England and by 1840, aged 27, was sub-controller of customs at Simonstown. That year he married Catherine Elizabeth Balston of Simonstown. By 1849 he was a big fish at Simonstown, resident magistrate, justice of the peace, sub-controller of customs, and also on the committee of the government school and the board of prisons. A person of power in a small outpost of the empire. In September 1855, the Cape Monitor, a small newspaper, published a report publicly accusing Pinney of being swayed by personal and vindictive motives in the discharge of his duties. This was a very strong accusation, and Pinney sued for libel. It went to the Supreme Court, where he lost. So I don't think he was a very nice guy. It isn't clear what happened next, but 10 years later, January 1866, the London Gazette announced he had been promoted. The Queen has been pleased to appoint Francis Bertrand Pinney to be Collector of Customs, Principal Comptroller of Her Majesty's Customs and Navigation Laws, and Registrar of Shipping for the colony, the Cape of Good Hope. A big job. Kate, please. I put this picture in because those houses on the other side of the main road, those are built on the land that Pinney owned. So you can see what a huge piece of land it was. Okay, he didn't own by the sea and he didn't own the point. He sold that quite quickly. Right, next. I'll deal first with the biggest earth that Pinney bought. As we saw, it was owned by Blake, who sold it to Pinney for £300, 1847. We're only concerned with the triangle abutting the main road. And you can see it there. Well, I'll come back to that. As it's where the first two houses past the harbour stand now, Fintimara and Killowen, or Springtide as it was later called. The earth was the only one Pinney didn't hold on to. Having owned it for 5 years, he sold it to William Papillon Jamison. Next one. And here we have him. He was another Simonstown man, a man of empire, Royal Navy officer, served on ships all over the world. I doubt if he had much direct contact with Kalk Bay. He didn't build a house on the site and kept it for 50 years. Amazing. Selling it in 1902 to the False Bay Fish and Coal Storage Limited. Pinney eventually returned to England, where he died in December 1896. He kept most of his Kalk Bay properties for 50 years, and most remained undeveloped. Pinney's death, far off Sussex, unleashed a wave of property sales and building along this stretch of the main road. We now need to move back to the previous century to see how the plots along this part of the main road came to be. As I mentioned before, it led to an explosion of development from 1897. Next, please, Kate. About 40 years before that, Francis Pinney sold or transferred these huge properties to his mother-in-law, Mrs. Catherine Ann Balston. I have no idea why he did that, whether he sold them or just transferred them. So she was the widow of Francis Balston, a wealthy agriculturalist, what we would call a farmer, I think, who farmed out in Caledon. He had also been in colonial service for years, and they had actually married in Calcutta. There were 9 children of the marriage, of whom the oldest was Catherine Elizabeth Balston, who was Pinney's wife. We can see the buildings that were there in 1853. They're on the sites of houses we now call By the Sea and Liscard.
That's right.
So there's one and there's one. Oops.
No, what have you done?
What have I done?
If you hit the remote,
The remote.
Where's
On
David?
the right-hand side.
it's gone. It's
Okay,
gone.
it's
Oh, no,
gone.
panic.
Sorry. The
I'm
plots were
very
subdivided over time, and apart from By the Sea itself, all of the Balston and Pinney properties came onto the market and were sold virtually in the same month in 1897. I haven't seen her estate papers. She died in 1876, and the terms of her will were such that her descendants were still fighting 50 years later. I didn't have access to Pinny's estate papers. They may be in the UK where he died. It's almost certain that the 1897 sales from these two estates were coordinated. According to my research, in September 1897, 6 plots owned by the estate of Catherine Balston were sold. And I'll just tell you them quickly. It's Liscard at 181, Abbey Craig at 177, Dysody at 175, Carmen at 171, Southolm at 173, Resthaven at 179. And in the same year, as I said, almost the same month, 4 plots were sold from the estate of Francis Pinney. 185 Main Road, the Dinghy at 191, the Ark at 193, and Sea Spray at 197. A total of 14 lots were snapped up in in no time building of new houses started, as we'll see. Kalk Bay was growing rapidly, and there's a big demand for these plots, situated as they were almost right on the sea and away from the crowded, poorer areas around the Middeldorp and De Lunt. This was by far the biggest spate of development in a growing Kalk Bay. Astute and wealthy buyers would have noted Kalk Bay Muizenberg had been granted municipal status in 1895. During 1897, definite plans had been announced to bring water from the Steenbras Dam to Kalk Bay. This would have made a huge difference to the value of properties. Right, so we will look at the housing in order, starting from near the harbour entrance. Please, Kate. Oh yes. So we're here. Is that, say, Cologne?
Yes.
Abbey Craig?
Yes.
And then we'll talk about these houses as the night wears on. There's by the sea. So, okay, Killowen. Thank you, Kate. And here we have, thank you, Tessa. This is Andrew Agnew and his wife, Mary. She was born Dempster. So, the homeowners, if you're coming along the main road from the harbour, it starts with Andrew Agnew and Killowen, or Springtide as we knew it later. They're a Northern Ireland couple, and they arrived in the Cape in 1902. In the account of his grandson, Andrew Agnew comes across as a very hard, humorless man. His grog shop in Northern Ireland had failed after he was converted and warned of the evils of alcohol by some passing American evangelists. He had married young. His first wife died when the 7th child, born in 10 years, was only 3 months old. He then married his housekeeper, this is Mary Dempster, who was about 7 years older than him. With a failed business in Ireland, the family moved to Kalk Bay, where he intended setting up a linen shop or a linen business. His grandson says that when he saw all the fish going to waste, the overcatch that they couldn't sell, they just threw it on the beach or threw it in the sea. He thought that there was a big opportunity. If you started an ice-making plant, you could get the fish cold and send them up to Johannesburg, where there's a huge demand because of all the workers coming into the gold mines. So next, please. This is just a picture I've added, thank you, Tessa, of the False Bay Fish and Cold Storage. It's one of several companies that opened and went insolvent in the early 1900s. So part of the Agnew history that I had paints a picture of Agnew being one of the driving forces, a leading figure in Kalk Bay's fishing industry. This seems to be a legend. Certainly he was involved, but probably as a management accountant. There was no mention of him in the books written about Kalk Bay or in the shareholder records that I have. It's not to say he wasn't, but I haven't found it. In his later years, he started a religious bookshop in Wynberg under the influence of an obscure Christian sect, the British Israelites. By all accounts, he was free with loans to anyone who professed to follow his beliefs. His wife, Mary, died in Kalk Bay in 1937 at the age of 85. and he died of chronic bronchitis at his home Fintimara, aged 82. He left 4 married daughters and 2 sons. Despite owning the Kalk Bay houses and other property in Wynberg on paper, at the winding up of his estate, his finances were in a mess and the estate was insolvent. So we'll go along the main road. Kate, next please. This is the lot that Andrew Agnew bought. It's a very strange shape. It's where the houses are now, Kiloan and or Springtide and Fintimara. They squeezed onto that. It was owned by Johannes Meyer. He was the 3rd mayor of Kalk Bay, Muizenberg, and he owned a whole lot of properties on the other side of the road, near the harbour entrance. Those houses that you see in old pictures, those were Meyer's houses. So Agnew bought it for a real bargain, 60 quid. It's a big piece of land. So that was about 200,000 rand in 1913. Thank you, Kate. So here's a familiar sight if you lived in Kalk Bay. This is, I'll call it Kiloan. It was only called Springtide much later. It's under, this was in 2019 this picture was taken. It was under major renovation. And just past it, there, you can see the roof line of his other house, Fintimara. So both of those names, Kiloan and Fintimara, are from Northern Ireland. I haven't been able to find any plans, but I know this place was built in 1924. So according to his grandson, Andrew he'd built Fintimara and he intended building a holiday cottage, but he was going to use second-hand materials, and he ordered in so much that in the end he built this instead of a holiday cottage. It had 13 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, 2 kitchens and various public rooms, and it operated as Kiloan boarding house. In 1942 it was sold from his estate to Bernard Weisenberg for, let's call it 1.6 million. The Weisenbergs, very well-known family in Kalk Bay. Bernard had a shop on the main road right early on, 1919. He also owned the station kiosk. It's still there. So he died in 1956. His son Laurie Weisenberg carried on running the business. Anyway, no sooner had Bernard bought this place than the well-known Kalk Bay busybody, Louis Ledan, wrote a letter to the city of Cape Town. It was headed, it'll come back on.
It's Louis Ledan.
Louis Ledan. So it was headed dilapidated, scandalous, disgraceful condition of slum property. So it's a terrible letter. It's vitriolic, it's anti-Semitic, and I'm not going to repeat any of it. But he lists a whole string of faults with the building. So I'm sure when the council employees got this letter, they went like, uh-oh, it's Louis Ledan again. And there was a bit of eye rolling. In the end, they only insisted they close an open drain. He sold the boarding house in 1950, Bernard Weisenberg. Now, I come to a very interesting story without photographs, but I'm sure you'll enjoy it. So it was bought by a guy called Gus Barnes. He was with Standard Bank, as a whole lot of other people were along here, and he retired, came to Kalk Bay. He's the wealthiest person I've come across in Kalk Bay. His manner of death is one of Kalk Bay's legends, and I've got that well-known raconteur of Kalk Bay stories, Peter Golis, to thank for this information, but it's true because I found all the papers in the archives. Anyway, he was born on the Kimberley diamond fields. His father was a debris washer, which, you know, I would think is a pretty low-level job, shaking the water over the stones. And his father, I found his estate file, so he left he wasn't a debris washer. He had some very minimal job when he died, and he had a house worth 300 something pounds. But Gus, I wish I had a picture of him. Gus had education. You know, they got him through school. He went to a commercial college. He then joined the forerunner. It was called African Banking Corporation, later Standard Bank. At the age of 20, started in Johannesburg, moved to Cape Town, etc. He retired at the age of 60 in 1949. He never married, and he decided to retire in Kalk Bay. He bought some land up Ponder Steps, but sold it a few years later. And then he bought Springtide. Thank you, Kate. Now, this is a critical part of the story. This gap between Kiloan and Fintimara. So I'd heard the story, and basically what the story is, he decided the place needed to be repainted. And for whatever reason, he was up the ladder himself when a fisherman came past and said, "I'll do that job for you for 7 6, 75 cents. Barnes said no, he was going to do it. And half an hour later, the fisherman came along. Barnes, the ladder had fallen. Barnes was lying. According to Peter, he was dead. In fact, he died 4 days later, and I have the medical record. He fell off a ladder, injured his neck and shoulder. So a bit of a stupid thing to do, but there we are. So then Peter said, and this is the part I like, Mrs. Sister Fish, who lived at the back of Windsor House, Sister Fish. She was a very well-known midwife, and she had the keys to the flat, and she knew Judy's granny, Mrs. Golis, very well. So I can just see these two. They got to get into the flat to see. They got in, and she was too scared to go in by herself. So they got in, and they looked around, and there was a big box ottoman, and they opened this thing up, and it was full to the top with debenture certificates, gold printed share certificates, etc., etc., etc. So it's mostly true. Peter described him as a very correct British gentleman with stud collars, often seen walking around the village with an umbrella. His mother as a little lady with black button-up shoes and a funny little hard black hat. So he died in 26th of May, and his estate was worth 112 million rand. Yeah, all those share certificates. It's a staggering amount. But you've got to ask the question, why was he living in Windsor House, Windsor Flats, anyway? So this is a problem. His will had been drawn up 34 years before, and the sole beneficiary was his mother. He'd never changed it. So she inherited the whole lot. There were about 5 other brothers, I think. So anyway, this poor old dear, she'd signed her will at the same time, 34 years before, 1921. And I think probably the shock of his death, she died 3 months later in hospital. So there was only one beneficiary in her will, and that was one of the other sons who was living in Windsor Flats. And he inherited, by then it had grown to 117 million. And I don't know, they disappear from the scene. So after that excitement, Kiloan was bought by Jack Evans, the father of our Kalk Bay, our own Ken Evans, our member. And it was Jack who changed the name of the building. Next please, Kate. Many of you will remember the Iona. It was Jack's charter boat. Right, thank you. Okay, wait, there's one more thing. The other significant owner of Kiloan or Springtide was Salman Boer, who bought Springtide in 1976. He told me years later that he had intended to retire to Kalk Bay, but had been too busy to do that. The building was very neglected, unoccupied, and there were instances where council had orders served on Boer, forcing him to effect minimal repairs. It went on for years, and I'm not going to go into all of that. There are people here who know a lot more about it than I do. Okay, Kate, let's go. Fintimara. This is where Andrew Agnew lived. He built this house. This is about 1920. It's a lovely picture. Thank you, Tessa. 169 Main Road. It's Northern Irish name, Fintimara. The plans for this house were passed in 1914, and they've been missing for 90 years, so I don't think they're going to turn up now. It's a pity.
You find those very easily because the owner is an architect.
They're not
His
there.
surname is Lowe.
They're not there. The original plans. Now, there's all correspondence in the files between architects back in the 1930s that just nobody knows. But it's worth a try, I suppose. So in 1942, it was sold on auction for £1,200, about 1.65 million. It's had many owners down the years. So next, please, Kate. This is William Dickey Clark and his wife Margaret.
Yeah.
It's a name that's...
This is a map.
Oh. All right, skip that. Go on to the next one.
There.
Change the text, but not the... Okay. So that's William Dickey Clark and his wife Margaret. It's a name that's quite well known in Kalk Bay. I think his son might have been a paediatrician. Anyway, they were Scottish and they'd married in Bloemfontein, of all places. He was a doctor there, secretary of the National Hospital in Bloemfontein, and he was also mayor of Bloemfontein, and there's even a street named after him. The couple bought Fintimara, January 1947. He was 68. He may well have retired as a doctor by then. I feel the couple probably uprooted themselves from Bloemfontein after many years there because of the death of their son George the previous January. George Dickey Clark was only 25 and serving as a captain in the Royal Indian Army Service Corps in Jerusalem when he was shot in an uprising. Palestine uprising. So, you know, some things have never changed. So William himself died 6 years later, was 74. And Fintimara was valued at that time at £2,100, but in fact it was sold at auction for much more than that, and about 2.6 million rand. So the last bit, it was bought by Harman Forra, a winemaker born in Holland. He only owned it for a year before selling it to Maynard Mills Goldberg, a professional golfer at Royal Cape. So, someone's phone. Okay, Kate. Uh-oh, that's him as the mayor. Next. I thought I deleted it. Right, they're the two houses. Okay, next one. So this is a piece of a 1902 map, and I put it up because I'm going to talk about. I just don't want to kick this over. I'm going to talk about By the Sea next. So there's By the Sea. There's Liscard, and all of this land here is where the other houses were built. So Abbey Craig and Rest Haven. It was just.
Was that always like servitude where the railway is?
Yeah. But the railway was already there.
Oh, okay.
But it was a servitude. They took the land from the railway. So okay. So now I'm going to Liscard I will cover in October if you can contain yourself until then. But I'm going to talk about a special house now, By the Sea. Right, Kate, By the Sea. Lovely photograph. On the left, By the Sea. On the right, Liscard. It's dated about 1895, and they were probably both holiday lets, these houses. But it may be that Catherine Belston lived in one of them and rented out By the Sea. The railway line had been extended to Kalk Bay in 1890, and you see how close it goes to those houses. So you can imagine, I mean, we think the trains make a bit of a noise now, but you imagine a steam train coming past your house, chuffing, clanking, the wheels making that screeching noise, they come round the bend. Anyway, so one of the newspapers summed up feeling about the railways: a vandalistic department, destitute of any sense of beauty and sacrificing attraction to a utility which will result in the destruction of the foreshore. They got that right, didn't they? So, first of all, by the sea. We look at its history from the early days. As I say, Catherine Balston had bought it in 1848. So there were buildings worth £230 on the site at that time. Very small. It would have been like a seaside shack, I would imagine. She died in 1876, and her estate sold the by the sea earth. Perhaps it was a far-sighted move with the known fact that the railway was going to be extended from Kalk Bay through to Simonstown. So it was bought by somebody called Ivo Acton Sampson. He'd spent holidays here as a boy, I think the whole family had, and we'll come across another Sampson, who's the wonderful name of Coldstream. That was his brother. He lived along the main road. So, but we can thank yet another brother, Vincent Sampson, later Supreme Court judge, for a really wonderful description of Kalk Bay in the 1860s and 1870s. He said, "It was when I was about 10 years old that I began to take a keen interest in fishing. My people took Miss Balston's for December, January and February. In the 60s and 70s it was the very heaven of fishing. How or when or why the Manila fishermen found their way to Kalk Bay I do not know, but they were there in my early boyhood and as I grew older. I was taught by many of them many of the secrets of their art, but one could catch fish in any quantities in those days off the rocks with any kind of rod and line. Gone are the now velvety John Browns, the Romans, the stumpnose, the bamboo fish, etc., etc., which swarmed in these waters." He goes on to say something that we can identify with 100 years later, but the shadow of its popularity was then already upon Kalk Bay, the Kalk Bay of my youth. But a few years saw its open green spaces crowded with houses, its rock fishing a thing of the past, its graceful simplicity perished in the extension of town life to its shores. Sound familiar? Anyway, all right, Kate, let's go. This is a wonderful picture of the Mills family standing in front of by the sea, which faced the sea. It's a wonderful picture. It's taken in about 1900. He bought the house in 1900. But as you can see, it's quite well weathered, which you would expect for the... Imagine the weather it would take there with the southeaster and the spray and everything. So they lived in Kenilworth, but there were many happy weekends out here. It remains with the family even to this day, 123 years later. And it's believed that Charles Mills and his wife named it by the sea. He was an 1820 settler. He was 1820 settler stock, and joined his father's business, the very well-known millers Daniel Mills and Son. Kate, thank you. I just put this picture in to give you an idea how big Daniel Mills and Son's milling business was. And this was only one location in Cape Town. It had about 5 premises in Cape Town. And Charles Mills became chairman. Thank you, Kate. This is about 1903. Lovely picture. And you can see by the sea they've added windows into the thatch roof, obviously to make more light and more space. They used to have hordes of people coming down apparently for weekends. Okay, it was beginning to show it had wear and tear now. You saw that picture, so it's hardly surprising. The original house built in 1830, Charles Mills employed the service of prominent architect, thank you, to design a new family home. 1915. This is a big house. I mean, you can't really get a size of it. So the original house was demolished and a new by the sea arose in its place. The plan was the work of prominent, prolific architect Charles Henry Smith. The plan shows a big house, 5 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a big dining room, servants' rooms, and so on. The only problem was it is far below the main road and the sewer line, so it couldn't be connected. So they first of all had what they called earth closets. I won't go into details. And they were replaced with chemical toilets. Right, Kate, thank you. So this is a picture in about 1920, after the house had been built, taken from the other side. And apart from the young boy, you can see that that's the stormwater drain that runs from where the spring was, and there's a pipe running from the house, I think, straight into the sea. And I don't know what it carried, but right. Kate, thank you.
Located on that site now.
What's that?
If you look at it, what building is located just to
This site? No, this house is still there. I mean, it's been renovated, but it's still there. I mean, that stormwater drain is still there. It hasn't changed very much. So, right, this is also a wonderful picture, the Mills and Glynn family group. In 1957, the house was inherited by Charles's unmarried daughter, Avis May Mills, known to everyone as Kissy. When she died in 1972, the house was kept in the family. It was bought by Ronald St. George Glynn, a relative by marriage. Kissy had asked that her carer and helper Kay, who in 1976 became Baroness St. John of Bletsoe, be allowed to use by the sea. Kay St. John was to remain there for more than 30 years until her death in 2007. Her son Anthony sits in the House of Lords. I believe it wasn't always easy for the Mills and Glynn family to work around Kay, who I'm told was one of life's characters. The Glynn family is still used by the sea as the much-loved ancestral family home. So, right, Kate? So here I put together the three owners of By the Sea since 1900. Charles Mills up to 1957, Kissy Mills up to 1975, and Ronald St. John Glynn from 1972 up to the present time in a family trust. Thank you, Kate. This is known as Mills Pool, and it was Kay who put it in. Of course, it's illegal, against the regulations, but I'm told she could often be seen floating around in here in an inner tube in her wetsuit, sometimes quite far out to sea. Thank you. So in 2023, major alterations started, and to answer your question, there at the end is that house that we could see. It's huge, this extension. Right, Kate, thank you. Next we see Carmen, 171 Main Road, crouched behind its security wall. Plot was about 440 square meters between Main Road and railway properties, carved off Mrs. Catherine Alston's plot in 1897, the magic year. The buyer was Edwin George White. He was part of a very successful and prosperous company called White, Ryan and Company. And his partner was Mr. Ryan. And yes, Edwin kind of cemented the partnership, because as a 21-year-old bachelor, he married the 29-year-old spinster daughter of his partner. Archive plan records of this time. Anyway, the firm was big. It operated about 10 different locations in Cape Town. Right, Kate. So I'm looking at this again. Yeah, so this is, before looking at the detail of Carmen, the map shows the situation by 1902. So Cologne and Fintimara had not been built, nor had Carmen. The house we will look at next. Right, further along, no, it's okay. All right, Kate, next. Oh yes, this is, sorry, I'm getting mixed up. This is the one. So we won't go into this all again. That was Fintimara. This is where Carmen was built. Okay, thanks. And there's a picture of it, taken in 2004. And I put this here because it's a picture that shows more or less what the house was like when it was built. I never found the plans, but you can see it was an H shape. And 20 years later, Kate, there, you can't really recognize it. It's completely buried under extensions and additions. So it's difficult to photograph these old houses with high security walls, electric fencing, etc., etc. But try and imagine them as open to the sea, without walls in front, in fact without walls behind to the main road. Fantastic views and fantastic fishing. So there was a valuation in 1924, and this house, Carmen, had the lowest value of all the houses along the strip. It was about 2.5 million. He sold it to Catherine Annette Wecker. She came to Kalk Bay to start a new life after her husband died. They were from the, up country, let's call it, up country, the sticks. So Kate, she had a plan done, which I won't, you can see the house is like a perfect square. She added a sun trap on the front overlooking the sea, and she added a little box on the side, another sun trap protected from the southeaster. So it was a very modest cottage. She died in Switzerland. She was 77, so I've no idea what she was doing there. Maybe she'd gone over to take the cure or something. Obviously it didn't work. She was a very wealthy woman. She left an estate of 2.5 million, big farm in Southwest Africa, farms in the Bloemhof district. And she'd also, this is interesting, she'd sold a whole lot of plots to Louis Ledan. And he built those houses, which if you buy the bulletin tonight, you'll read all about it in Ledan Road. It's on sale there. Barry will sell you one. Right, next. Let's get a move on. So this is Les Arris, born in Vancouver and one of the owners of Carmen. I don't know much about him. The family lived here for 25 years. After the war, he opened a chemist shop in Hoff Street. But there was a memorable event. It happened 25 years after he bought the house. It caught fire. To quote an eyewitness, one who's sitting in the front row here, in fact. All I remember is when the house had Tudor-style cladding, Mrs. Tromp van Dichelen lived there, and there was a fire about 1969. Des here and I rushed over. We managed to open the front door, and she was lying right there at the door. We dragged her out, and she was okay after a while. There's the hero of the piece. So David still lives at Resthaven, a few houses further on. Day of high drama. So she was, in fact, the sister of Les Arris. She'd married Tromp, and she was visiting or staying there, I don't know. The damaged house was sold immediately after the fire, bought by the famous Springbok Jerry Brand, who restored the house and sold it the next year. Jerry was working as an estate agent, partnership of Zotendijk and Brand. Next. Here we see the next owner of Carmen, who bought in 1970, David's cousin, Reine de Villiers. David's aunt. And you'll remember he rescued Mrs. van Dichelen. Anyway, I used this photograph because it shows the mock Tudor that was used on this house when it was first built. It was restored like that after the fire, but of course it's all disappeared, and that door doesn't seem to exist now. Right, Kate. On. Right. We see here the large earth bought by Harriet Burr from the estate of Catherine Ann Balston in 1897. It was one plot despite that dotted line. She was the wife of, next please, George Kunrad Bear, the well-known estate agent, auctioneer, and they were quite a prosperous family. She's the mother of 10 children. They also had land on the other side of the main road, hence Bear Road. Right, next. So there's the cul-de-sac named Western Street. Originally the lane had gone down to the level crossing which went led to a path down to the harbour. And at the bottom of the road you can see the roof line of By the Sea. Next. And this is South Home. It stands on that earth today. It was bought by a guy, the earth was bought by a guy called Lehman Saunders Sloman. He subdivided. So it's a big house and quite bulky, designed in 1913 by well-known architects McGillivray and Grant. They're very active in this area, and one of their most famous houses is Watergate, also known as Graceland, on the main road. Right. He was a City of Cape Town councillor when this picture was taken. Yep.
Next.
Oops. Oh, that's the house. Yes. Sorry. Next. Right. That's him. They were both born in England, he and his wife. They married in Rondebosch. I found out very little about him except they were very wealthy. I think he had interests in electrical engineering, which of course was a fledgling business at that time. They're members of the Botanical Society of South Africa, and she was also involved with the SA Jewish War Appeal. Okay, Kate. So, yeah, you can take that away. I should have deleted all of this. So I just put this on again because of this. This is the extension. It's got this strange kind of, and it isn't on the other side of the house. It's a bit strange, should I say. It seems like an imbalance. But anyway, it's a big extension, and I don't know when it was done or who did it, but I think it was probably Sloman. So now, Kate, next. Every picture tells a story. And I want to just show you these two arches. The one is the front door of South Home. And I believe, there it is there, I believe it's the work of the master mason William Delbridge. The picture on the right is an arch in the parking garage across the main road at Roxton. We know that he built this second arch in 1921. And if you look at these diamond tips on the tops of the stone, you'll see the same on the other door. But more important, if you walk down Gatesville Road and you look at the stone houses along there, they've all got those same arches. If you look at Muizenberg Railway Station, all built by Delbridge. So anyway, I don't think the Slomans ever lived in Kalk Bay. He died in Amanus in 1960. Right. Very quickly, this couple, they bought its Morris Parr, P-A-R-E, and his wife Agnes Nenita. So they were born in London. Strange, but I know very little about them. So 11 years after buying, the house was sold in 1945, and I think he might have been under financial pressure because he was renting Baverstock on the main road in St. James. And he had quite a modest estate, 3.3 million. Okay, now, next. Still got a way to go here, I'm afraid. So in 1945, South Home was sold to John Winchester Anderson, shown here at age 45 with his son John. He was known by his family as Jack, and I'll use that name from now on. The family were descendants of a whole line of Scottish sea captains. At some point, his father had bought extensive land opposite Greenpoint Lighthouse, and he lived there in a large house called Alexander Place. Next. So the son was John Jack Winchester Anderson. He was also a Springbok number 89. Born December 1881, great athlete and rugby player. Age 22, he was selected to play the last crucial test against the 1903 Great Britain touring team. He played for Hamilton's, he went to the Transvaal, he captained Pirates, but to quote a family account, He was asked to go on the 1906 Springbok tour to the UK, but his wife-to-be, Albania Phillips, wouldn't let him. He was back at Hamilton's in 1913, a lifelong member. He went into the hotel business, and there's a belief that Winchester Mansions, now Winchester Mansions Hotel at Sea Point, originally a block of flats, was built by Jack, and hence its name, John Winchester. Okay, next. So this is Jack in later years, obviously, and his wife Albania. They married in the Transvaal. They were in the liquor and hotel business and owned the Standard Hotel in Napier Street. And next. This is a picture of outside South Home. They loved living there. There are lots of happy snaps of the children and the grandchildren fishing on the rocks. So, next. It was during this time that South Africa's Charles Atlas, Tromp van Dichelen, was living in Anderson Road. As we've seen, Tromp's wife was part of the Ayres family who lived next door to South Home. An Anderson family anecdote describes how Kalk Bay was hardly big enough for these two very big men. On many occasions, Jack and Tromp would come upon each other as they walked along the pavement in Kalk Bay, and they were too big to pass each other, requiring one of them to step off the pavement and yield to the other. Jack never yielded to Tromp. So they lived in Kalk Bay, and then tragedy, 1953, Albania died. She was 68 at South Home, and I'm told by the family that Jack literally died of a broken heart 6 months later at a heart attack. Their death notice described both of them as hotel proprietors. They had 3 adult children. Next, Kate. And there's an aerial shot of South Home as it is now. And next. This is Dysody on the main road, number 175. And it always seems to be like crouched down with its back to all the noise and the people racing by. Next. From the seaside, a completely different picture. Imposing Dutch gables, now unfortunately behind security wall. Life was very different in 1913 when visitors to the Dysody guest house could cross the railway line and walk down to Dysody Pool. Thank you, Kate. It's passed into memory, this pool. The older generation will remember it. Very rocky, but in 1927, the council were looking at all the pools in the area, and they got somebody to go and look at this place and maybe put a pool there. So a proposal was put forward, remove all those rocks, loose rocks, and put a path down from the subway. The quote was £500, and they decided it was too expensive. And to this day, everybody who lives around there goes, thank God for that. Because obviously it was designed for all the holiday makers who arrived to come down there. Right, the history of the house. Right, Kate, thank you. So this is a house Mrs. Bear had designed. A nice little cottage. But go on. So this is Sloman's house, and there's where Mrs. Bear's house wasn't. That plan I just showed you, I'm sure the house was never built. I mean, they wouldn't have demolished it, between 10 years later. So, anyway, Sloman sold the house to the splendidly named Violet Marion Delvares Weiber, born Borchers. Sometimes she was Marion Violet, sometimes she was Violet Marion. Anyway, I'll call it. She had plans passed, Kate, thank you, for alterations in 1918. And so Dysody had already been built by 1918. And you can see here, there's the footprint of the houses. So, what I'm saying is the Burr house was never there. And you'll see the one street was called C Street. Seemed like a good name, but anyway, it never stuck. So next, the alterations were to the back of the house, facing Main Road, and their rooms and bathroom added. The plans were drawn by architect Darwood Jacobs, 1915. And externally, Dysody looks very similar. Violet had married Henry Bloxham Wyber. So he was a lieutenant, it was the Boer War. And just to give you his full background, he was Henry Bertram Bloxham Wyber, son of Henry Wyber, Esquire, alderman of the City of London, great-grandson of the Emperor William of Prussia. Okay, he resigned his commission, became a civil servant, and he was in the Customs Department. And we've got to thank the current owners of Dysody, Joan Travers Phillips, to thank for some information on the Wyber family in 1915. In 1915, my mother's Zotendijk family spent 6 months in the downstairs of Dysody, while Mrs. Wyber and family lived upstairs and rented out the downstairs. My mother, who was 12 years old, went by train to Rondebosch to school at Rustenburg. She said the Wybers went to the Catholic Church in St. James, and son Dick became a Jesuit priest. Anyway, it's been difficult to find background on the Wybers. But the name, I know that the name, so it was a boarding house. And I just want to say, 1921 in Kalk Bay, there were 16 boarding houses, a lot of competition. But the interesting thing, there were 3 blacksmiths, 1921. So, I mean, there were still horse and carts around. Anyway, Dysody, the name comes from the 3 children's name, Diana, Sonia, and Dick. Dysody. Okay, there were other major players in the story of Dysody. And 2, I have to tell you the story. I'm sorry, it's dragging on. Arthur Barray Phipps, his wife Hester. So, Kate, next. So, all of England would have choked over their tea and kippers at breakfast when the newspapers arrived late in January 1879. We all know Isandlwana had been a military disaster for the British, and our man Phipps, he was a lieutenant and he was right in the thick of it. He went on to the Battle of Ulundi, where he was seriously injured. It's a long and winding road from there. He was born in the Isle of Wight, and he ended up in Kalk Bay in 1917. He met and married his wife in Bulawayo. She was about 20 years younger than him. And we can only speculate how he met her, because how many women could there have been in Bulawayo? Anyway, single women, I mean. And he was then in Kwekwe, where there would be very few people at all, men or women. So 6 years later, he signed a lease, next please, for Dalebrook Boarding House. And a new life beckoned, but disaster struck within a month. Sparks from the chimney set the whole place on fire, just as the guests were sitting down to breakfast. And fortunately, everyone got out safely, but the guests' belongings were saved, but the Phipps lost everything. All of the furniture and fittings of the boarding house. They had no insurance, but the good people of Kalk Bay rallied round, as they always do, and there was a fundraiser run by the Reverend Book of Holy Trinity, and Lady Helena Juta organized a concert. With the funds they had, Phipps signed a lease to take over Dysody in 1921. Sadly, he had a bad time. He died of a heart attack 3 years later. But part of the reason I'm going on about this, because although I don't have a floor plan for Dysody, his will shows that house, which I don't think is very big, had 10 guest bedrooms, a lounge, dining room and kitchen, and 1 bathroom. For 10. That's how it was. He left very little in his will. So the next person was Alexander Calder. He was a tenant and then he bought the place. Calder's very well known in Kalk Bay. His father had built Castle Hill in Strathmore. And of course the family were associated with the King's and the New King's Hotel for 50 years. He sold Dysody in 1949, and the next person was, yes, that's a lovely picture. This is Zoe and her husband, Harold Francis Armstrong, Mo Dunn, Zoe Zotendijk. So Henry Wyber, who'd owned Dysody, was a customs officer, and her father was a customs officer. And I can't believe it's a coincidence that they bought this house. I think they were looking for a house. They knew it. She'd stayed there as a young girl, and they bought it. So she married Mo Dunn, as he was known, who she met quite by chance when she was on holiday in White River. He was an ex-English army officer. He'd come to South Africa to make his fortune. Their 2 daughters were born in White River. So Zoe was a member of the very large Zotendijk clan. She had 60 cousins. She and Mo moved to South America for a while and then tried farming at Citrusdal and back in White River. Finally, they settled in Kalk Bay, where Mo opened a small florist shop called Margarita's. It was next to E.K. Green. Anyway, it didn't work. So the kids went to Springfield and their brother went to Marist. Of course, like all kids in those days, they went on the train. So she died at Dysody in 1982. Sorry, Mo died in 1982. Zoe passed away there in 1985. Next, please, Kate. That's her and her. That's Zoe in later life. Okay, next. Zoe's daughter Joan had married Ian Travers Phillips, and on her mother's death, Joan inherited Dysody in 1985, and this ownership continues until today. The house has been owned by the same family for 73 years. Right, the last house we're coming to, you'll be glad to hear. The impressively large Abbey Craig, 177 Main Road. And next, another 1897 sale from the estate of Catherine Balston to Elizabeth Willman. So he was a merchant, born in England. It was a spec buy, and they sold it on to a guy called John Watson. Next. And so it went. 6 years later, they didn't build anything. It was all spec buying. They sold 6 years later, so 1909, John Whitfield Harsent, another Englishman investing in Kalk Bay, another general manager from the Standard Bank. I swear it was a club. And I'm sure he's looking forward to retiring, spending time at Liscard and perhaps fishing off the rocks. Sadly, it was not to be. He died of heart failure in Rondebosch when he was 61. He was still working. Right, Kate. So I go back to this 1902 map, and you see the whole strip. Oh. Yes, Liscard and the plots. Okay, we've seen that before. Abbey Craig was there. Right. So by 1920, nothing had changed. No house had been built. Robert Denton Pitt, who we'll talk about some more in October, if you could wait, a wholesale manager born in England, Middlesex, employed by the very successful company Brown Lawrence. He bought these properties, sold 2 empty Irvine to Lillian Maud Sprigg, as they've sewed in the deeds, a spinster. So it was some kind of mark of shame. But he kept Liscard, where he lived with his wife and 6 sons. It must have been heaven for these young boys, 6 of them. So Miss Sprigg sold the 2 plots and disappeared. I think she was a relative. I think she must have been a relative of the 4 times Prime Minister of the Cape, Sir Gordon Sprigg, who owned a house in the Dan Road. Anyway, next, Kate. So although she was only here briefly, she left us this nice painting of the Ark, which is a few houses further on. So he sold the plot, registered the name, and it was registered the name of Ethel Barling. Her husband Frederick was yet another English immigrant who had done well for himself. He owned the major bakery and confection business, Barling's Bakery in Woodstock. They had another investment in rapidly developing Kalk Bay. In 1921, they bought what is now Edward Mansions. So the Abbey Craig Earth had stood empty for 24 years, and then the Barlings, in the 1920s, they joined the building boom. Thank you, Kate. Prominent architects, William Black and Fagg, Many houses around here, including Roxton across the road. Wonderful drawings. If you see the whole thing, it's fantastic. Unusual design with one bedroom, a very big lounge, the bathroom and kitchen on the ground floor. Unusual feature was the conservatory looking over the sea. Thank you. Upstairs was one big bedroom, a maid's room and a box room. There was no upstairs bathroom. Anyway, it's a lovely house. It directly show the Barlings living here, certainly in the summer months. While it's known as Abbey Craig, the Barlings named it Den Fretha, I don't know how you pronounce it, also the name of their Mowbray home. And they had an adopted son called Dennis, and I'm sure Den Fretha was made up of their three names, Dennis, Frederick, and Ethel. It must have been a craze. So it was sold to Annie Moyer Frost in 1925, only 4 years after it was built. Frederick Barling died. He was only 60 in Mowbray, a big estate, 52.8 million rand. And that didn't include the properties registered in his wife's name. Kate, thank you. And this is somebody some of you will know.
Right.
Dennis Barling
Very much so.
was the husband of the very well-known character Lynette Barling. And we all know she organized the Mardi Gras. When I was 17, she used to shout at us. And many other events. She was a hell of a character.
She was, that she was.
Okay. So this is a picture, thank you. This is in the lane, unnamed cul-de-sac that leads to the subway. I've put it on A because it shows how big Abbey Craig is, but also major alterations. So the original roof ran, how can I put it, the roof ridge was parallel to the main road, and these major alterations over the years, it's now perpendicular. They've swung the whole roof design around. So here's another interesting aside from a local resident who shall not be named, but is actually sitting in the front row. The cul-de-sac never had a name. One of the owners of Abbey Craig, whose name was Philip, decided that with Travis Phillips on one side and him on the other, the name should be Phillips Close. He had signs made and erected. Right, next, Kate. This pipe was built at the bottom of the road under the railway line. Takes water runoff and drains what is left of the spring that had been such a vital source of water. Today there's no sign of the spring. And here I have some more interesting inside information. Someone who shall be nameless is actually also sitting here. After the stormwater pipe was installed, and as kids it was very exciting to crawl right up the pipe about 60 meters to the main road and look through the grating and the cars passing. If it had rained hard, we would have been washed out to sea. Right, Kate? So, to get back to the owners, this is Ernest Frost, the husband of Annie Moyer, who bought the house in 1925. They owned it for 23 years and renamed it Abbey Craig. He was, funny enough, with the Standard Bank. And he ended his career as Deputy General Manager. They had a house in Kloof Street, rented out Abbey Craig. So they moved here when he retired. So much of what we know is from an interview we had with their son, Esden, in 2014. He was about 90 at the time. And one of our members went over and saw him in England and recorded. Wonderful. They moved to Kalk Bay when he was 10, and he attended Miss Kemp's school until he started catching the train to Bishop's. I just want to share this with you because I think this is the most wonderful little story. Kate, this is a picture Esden Frost painted in 1984, and it's not intended to be accurate, but it's like a capsule, a time capsule of some of the characters. So he says, the figure seated in the bread van is me. I travel to school every morning in the Piatt's bread van, courtesy of their driver, an Englishman called Ted Page, seen at the back of the van. He was an entertainer of some kind, and later formed a full-time concert party to raise money for war funds. I attended Miss Kemp's school at the Holy Trinity Church. The rector was the Reverend Vernon de Smit, seen with his wife on the extreme right of the picture.
Oh,
Although
in
they,
a hat.
although they had no children, they always addressed each other as mummy and daddy.
We used to see them coming and run like blazes.
Left of centre is Mr. Koenig, the Prussian owner or manager of the Majestic Hotel, straight from the pages of Tintin. The sandwich man is Mr. Jones, commissionaire of the Olympia Bioscope, who was regularly obliged to walk through the streets, ringing a bell, dressed in a costume to suit the forthcoming attraction. The Wild West, Cavaliers, and in this case, the Foreign Legion. The policeman is Tommy Cass, descended from a Glaswegian family via Stanford. The fisherman is an amalgam of various characters seen in and around Kalk Bay Harbour, the unknown fisherman. Extreme left is Mr. Slumdeen, a wealthy cartage contractor. I best remember him for his kapparangs, the wooden slip-slops with a knob that fitted between the first and second toe. It's a great story. So they sold Abbey Craig in 1941 and went off and built a magnificent house in Prenton Street. It's called Woodley, beautiful place. So they were happily settled there, but years later their daughter Joan clearly remembered the day the postman, whose name was Fernandez, coming along Quarterdeck Road with a telegram announcing the death of my brother Robin at Castiglione di Popoli, northern Italy, 1945. He was only 23 and was part of the Allied invasion force in Italy. As his younger brother Esden told us, the Woodley dream was shattered. Right, Kate. Abbey Craig, I'm nearly there. It was sold to Louisa Maria Moller in 1941 and she owned it for 3 years. I wouldn't normally bring her because she was such had it for it, but anyway, we're lucky to have this picture of her because it shows her with her grandson, a boy who would grow up to be the father of South African surfing in the 1960s, John Whitmore. Right, next, we're nearly there, I keep saying that. So the Baines, they owned Abbey Craig for about 14 years. Here we see May, a nurse trained at St. Bart's in London, gone to Rhodesia where she met her husband Josiah Joe Bain. So there's a little story about him. When he was 1, the family went on a trek from Maseru, led by Groot Tom Moody, and they trekked 1,600 kilometers with this 1-year-old kid up to Rhodesia. So I'm sure life was very hard. This is a picture you can see, you can see and that's Joe on the right. He was about 9 or 10 then, I suppose, with his father. They had 2 daughters, Dawn and Brenda, and like the children at Dysody, the family were also Catholic. We are lucky to have a personal view from Brenda. We left Salisbury and went to East London, bought a big house in the Nahoon Valley, then came to Cape Town for schooling. I went to Standard 3, Dawn to Standard 5 at Star of the Sea. My dad, with hat and walking stick, used to walk down to the beach by the harbour, collecting treasures from the beach, old buttons, shells, etc. My mom was born in a small Scottish village and was always known as Scotty Bain. She was a member of the Musenberg Bowling Club, a fun-loving, kind mother who's sorely missed. Right, Kate. They sold up in 1965 and the house was bought by Arthur Christopher Smith, an accountant and later director of Maskew Miller, the leading printing and publishing company. He lived at Abbey Craig with his wife, Peggy, and their famous daughter. Next. Probably pure coincidence that Margie Smith came to live here. The house had been the home of John Whitmore's granny many years before. Whitmore was now Margie's mentor and coach. To quote, in July 1966, Margie Smith, a 17-year-old from Kalk Bay, made history when she won the first official South African Women's Surfing Championship title. Her victories put her on the surfing map, and in September 1966, she was selected to represent the Springbok surfing team at the 3rd International Surfing Federation in San Diego, where she was placed in the top 10. So, another Springbok came to be part of the history of Kalk Bay. I will list them: Doug Hopwood, Cyril Hammond, Vincent Clutie, Jack Anderson, Margie Smith. And that brings me to the end. My God. Let 'em